And Alex?
Yes, hello everybody. I'm Alexandra Katabo.
We are co-directors of HEJSupport International, a non-governmental organization working on environmental health and environmental justice, with a focus on women and vulnerable communities across the globe. Women are affected differently by chemicals because of their gender role and their physiology. Often policies, projects, and research do not take this into account. To change the approach and to make women's voices heard, HEJSupport International started its webinar series on women and chemicals. And today, we are hosting our first webinar in this series with the focus on women and mercury.
Mercury is considered to be one of the major environmental pollutants. There are three forms of mercury: elemental or metallic mercury, inorganic mercury compounds, and organic mercury compounds. Routes of human exposure to mercury includes food like fish, seafood, wildlife, and even rice. Mercury vapor can be inhaled during mercury evaporation in different processes, including from dental amalgam restorations. Mercury-containing skin lightening creams is also a known route of mercury exposure. Women living and working close to industrial sources of mercury emissions and releases, or in small gold mining communities, suffer from mercury exposure. However, even those living in industry-free areas but consuming mercury-contaminated food are also exposed to this toxic and non-essential metal in the human body.
And indeed, mercury is highly toxic. Many severe, irreversible, and deadly diseases are associated with mercury exposure. What is even more troubling is that mercury can cross the placenta and accumulate in fetal tissues. Prenatal exposure of mercury poses a health threat, particularly to the developing brain. And being the first environment for children, women at the same time could unwillingly become a threat to their future babies, and sometimes are blamed by their partners for giving birth to sick kids. Today's webinar is an attempt to highlight the problem of mercury exposure on women from the perspective of developing and developed countries, and to look for solutions. So we are glad to welcome 5 world-recognized experts working on different aspects of mercury exposure in women. Today, we will hear from Yuyun Ismawati from Indonesia, Professor Donna Mergler and Professor Mélanie Lemire from Canada, Pamela Miller from Alaska, and Marianne Bailey from the Minamata Convention Secretariat. After their presentations, we will have a question and answer session, and you can also type your questions in the chat box during the presentations. And I would like to say that the webinar is recorded, and we will share the recording on the HEJSupport website along with the summary of the discussion. And now I would like to welcome Yuyun Ismawati. But before introducing Yuyun to you, I would like to say that today is Yuyun's birthday, and so congratulations and happy birthday, Yuyun, and thank you very much for joining our webinar on this special day for you. So Yuyun has broad and rich experience in the environmental health and environmental management. Her main concern is to protect the health of the vulnerable populations, especially women and children, from toxic chemicals and waste exposure. And she's a founder of Nexus3 Foundation and a Goldman Environmental Prize awardee of 2009. So Yuyun, the floor is yours.
Hang on. Thank you, Olga. I'm going to turn my video on.
Before you start, Yuyun, can you tell me if your presentation is seen?
Yes,
Okay.
it is in the folder. No?
Can I share it from my laptop?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah, sure. So.
Okay, thank you. Oh, okay, excellent.
Can you do it now?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, you can see it, right? You should see it now.
Olga, can you see it? Because I'm.
Yeah, I think I'm sharing my screen now.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yes, please.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much for coming and celebrate my birthday. Yay. Thank you for Olga and Alex for arranging this. No. It's not meant for. Thank you. It's okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. You can type it in the chat box. Yeah, it's coincidentally. Okay, what I would like to share this time is highlighting about women and Mercury, but most of you already knew this, but I would just like to refresh.
Sorry, but Yuyun, I'm sorry, we do not see your screen. We do not see your screen. Alex, I think that it would be better if we share the screen of Yuyun's presentation.
Okay, you have it.
And it is in the folder.
Yes, I know. You can start. I try to bring it up.
Okay. Yeah. So let's see. Yes, I just want to introduce my organizations, previously known as Bali Focus Foundation, but since 2019 we changed the foundation's name into Nexus3, Nexus for Health, Environment and Development. So you will
hear more and more that my organization's name changed from Bali Focus to Nexus3. Yuyun?
Yes.
Yuyun?
Yes.
Yuyun, now please unmute yourself. We do not hear you. Now your presentation is on the screen.
I have unmute myself. Can you hear it?
We do not hear you.
Yeah, I hear you.
I can hear her. I can hear her clearly.
Yes. So just continue, Yuyun. We can hear you.
Okay. Yes, so my organization's name has changed into Nexus3. I'm not moving to another organization, but stay with my organizations. Next, please. Alex?
Yeah, I'm doing it.
Okay. Yeah, so as I have been asked by Alex and Olga to share, this is the structure of my presentations, and I hope we can share more insights from this webinar today. Next, please. Yes, so we all know that the Mercury is coming from products and processes. Sorry, I have to add processes in that title, because it's coming not only from products that we use, but also from the emissions of processes, mining and coal-fired power plants, production and manufacturers of stuffs and so on. Next, please. Yes, so we all know that the exposures of mercury coming from various sources got into the pathways through food, air, and water, and also converted into methyl mercury in food. Once they coming out to the environment, they cannot be put back into the bottles. So the genie has been out, cannot put back in the bottle. And we can trace it in biomarkers in blood, urine, hair, cord blood, in umbilical cord in some communities. And the outcomes can be different from one person to another, depending on the immune system, depending on the compositions of health and the nutrients in they intake. The next, please. And of course, the dose and time. So as I mentioned before, that it can be coming also from the air pollutions, from the processes, from coal-fired power plants, and then deposited into the ocean, consumed by the fish, and then eventually get into woman's body through the food that they ingested. Not only fish, but also other food. But fish have been proven as the main source of mercury exposure to people, especially women in childbearing age, that can carry and pass on the mercury to their fetuses and babies. Next, please. Yeah, the experience from Minamata Convention, Minamata disease, I'm sorry, from Minamata disease shows that the major sources of mercury in Minamata diseases are coming from fish consumption in Japan, coming from the pollutions of the wastewater discharged by factory that use mercury as catalyst. Next, please. And another route of exposures I mentioned before already. This is the example of mining from SGM or small-scale mining activities, that mercury discharged or released to the environment through the burning of amalgam, and also the wastewater from the processing stage. And they ended up in the rice fields, in the fish pond, and also in the air. And eventually, the communities also eat the fish and the rice, and they got intoxication. Next, please. In congenital Minamata disease children, there are, I think it's about 28 children identified at that time in '92 by Dr. Harada. And most of the children were born with birth defects or deformation in every part of their bodies. Some of them are still alive until now. Some of them passed away already. Next, please. And as I mentioned before, that pregnant women are actually very sensitive to any kind of intakes and nutritions. The effect of heavy metals and high concentrations of mercury in this case affect the development of fetuses in the 3 months, within 9 months, and also it will affect the children's development after they were born and they grown up until 10 years old. So yeah, I've seen some examples in the field, and some children might look normal, but after a period of time, their health degenerated. Next, please. So Dr. Suda from University of Kumamoto presented this chart. And he mentioned at that time that because in Japan, it's very common to keep the umbilical cord in every family of their children. So it's very easy to collect the samples of umbilical cord and then analyze the mercury concentrations in the umbilical cord. They managed to identify the high concentrations of umbilical cord, mercury in umbilical cord back in '54. And the concentrations of mercury in umbilical cord increased until 1970, until the government stopped the discharge of wastewater from Chiso Corporation factory. And with this kind of findings or informations, actually the government can take action earlier to prevent further poisoning. Next, please. In 77 countries all over the world, we have now a gold rush, 21st century of gold rush. And why this is happening? It's because the remaining deposits of gold now sitting under the protected areas, indigenous peoples areas, that's not feasible for large gold mining companies to operate. So it can be accessed only by small scale miners. That's why we see a lot of artisanal and illegal gold mining taking place in many countries. Next, please. And by using mercury in SGM, SGM is artisanal and small scale gold mining, miners using mercury to mix it with the ore and then burn it to get the gold. Unfortunately, this exposure from mercury in the air is not only affecting miners, but also the communities in general in that village. And this is the study conducted by Herman Gibbs and Aureri back in 2014. They collected lots of studies from various countries and various publications showing that in many SGM countries, neurological symptoms shown in many studies, that the highest mercury measured in urine was up to 1,600. That's very, very, very high compared to the safe level, which was 50 microgram per gram. And next, please. And that will affect also the not only the kidney, but also the whole metabolism in the body. And this is also showing the hair of mercury in hair women in many SGM countries and communities from that study, showing that the highest one was about 95 or 96 ppm. And the safe level is 1 ppm. Next, please. This is the more shocking and sad fact that children and infants also have high mercury concentrations, and I believe they should not have this, but how come children get it? That's from the mothers mostly. Next, please. I tried to find some papers that will be interesting to take a look at, because some poisoning happening in a very short period of time, and some are low dose but very long time. We call it chronic poisoning, and the high concentrations in very short period of time, we call it acute poisoning. There are several examples of them, but in this slide, I'm showing the results of the study from Iran when they have mercury poisoning, acute mercury poisoning on the right side. Sorry, not Iran, but Iraq. Communities consume grains that contaminated with fungicides that has mercury, high mercury concentration. And as the concentrations of mercury in hair increase, various kind of health problems also suffered by the communities. And over a period of time, after 6 months, and after the community stop and the products also taken out, the number of populations with health problems also decreased, and also they monitored the hair concentration also decreasing, and health improved after the hair mercury hair concentration also decreased. While on the left side, it shows the latency period. It means once you're exposed, some of us will not show the symptoms immediately, and the onset will take place, will be happening more than 16 more than 16 days. So before 16 days, you might have no symptoms at all. But in chronic poisoning, the latency period could be up to 15 years. Next, please. I've seen one of the example of latency period in some of the victims of Kodaikanal. If you don't know, Kodaikanal is a village in India that has used to have a thermometer factory owned by the subsidiary of Unilever. And back in 1998, 1980 something until year 2000, they used a lot of mercury, and most of the workers got poisoned. 43 men died due to the very high concentrations of exposure from the manufacturing processes. And the women, this lady on the left top, she works as the cleaner. She cleaned the floor of the factories and scoop the mercury from broken thermometers that was discarded by most men on the top right, who works as the quality control in the room of 30 people. So the mercury, they scoop mercury into the bucket with bare hand. And this lady stopped working there for 2 years, and then she has her son, which was born with anomalies. And all of the children at the bottom also shows some of them have no ear and so on and so on. So I met some of them when I visited Kodaikanal 3 years ago. Thank you. No, next please. And back to the mercury and gold, why they use mercury to extract gold. It's easy and can be done anywhere you want, because it's very easy. And burning gold also taking place in the kitchen because it's so easy. All the family also watch how much gold the father will today. Next please. But that kind of activity is also affecting children. I'm sorry, I didn't give you the warning at the beginning. These pictures were taken from many artisanal small-scale gold mining hotspots. And some of the mothers also have high mercury concentrations in their hair. Some of them I cannot find the mother, because the children live with the grandmothers or with other family members. And the bottom right is the recent picture I took from Kenya. I met the boy, he was born with that hand as well, like the other babies that I saw in Indonesia. Next, please. And all of this poisoning and intoxication actually, of course, affecting the economic development and of the community. A study done by Nadine Stackling et al. In 2017 shows that 25 until 33% of miners globally actually suffered from chronic metallic mercury vapor poisoning or intoxication. And in Indonesia, that number is between 18 to 23%. And if Indonesia have 1 million miners, this is not to mention the communities that affected in that village. And another study done by Leo Trasande also calculating the economic losses in 15 countries, not only from SGM, but also from other sources of mercury pollutions, can affect countries' economy a lot. And in this case, globally, at least between 77 million until $130 million per year. And in Indonesia, I checked the data, it's about 900,000 until 1.6 million a year US dollars. I don't know how we are going to recover from this. But I understand that COVID is everywhere now, but this is the hidden pandemic that has been ignored by many countries. Next, please. Yeah, so all of us know that Minamata Convention already ratified back in 2000, adopted in 2013 and ratified by 2017. And until last week, I noticed that currently there are 121 countries already ratified the Minamata Convention. So I hope with all of these parties sign up and committed to reduce the mercury pollutions, we can see more and more less products and processes using mercury. Monitoring of environmental matrices and biomarkers are very, very important. However, many countries do not have the capacity to measure it. Either they don't have sufficient laboratory or do not have sufficient fund to monitor it. So when we talk about the pandemic now, COVID-19, about track and traces, I think we have to do this also in mercury poisoning. We have to track and trace this, not to worry about the contamination or the contagions to other people, but to monitor the person health, so we can ensure that especially the vulnerable groups can be protected. And then health services need to be improved. And then women of childbearing age, especially before they get pregnant, health workers need to ensure that they have sufficient folic acid, iron, vitamin E, vitamin C, vitamin A, because this can improve, at least protect them from the poisoning of their children. And next, please. Yeah, so lessons learned from Minamata is that we have to act on symptoms. We've seen high concentrations of mercury in hair, in biomarkers, and in the environment. So we hope that the government can speed up and taking actions on symptoms if they've seen it's high now. And then identify the sources, investigate the health effects, how far it affects people, and so on. And then implement liability and compensation, especially for pollutions caused by institutional agency or by factory, I mean. And then raising public awareness, and then clean up the site in a timely manner. So the point number 6 is very challenging for all of us, but we have to find a way to do this. Next. I think you can watch the video. You can have this slide later. You can click the video and learn how to detect. And then lastly, we also created a new program for children so their ecological rights can be upheld, especially how to empower women, mothers, teachers, and health workers also included in this approach. Thank you so much for listening. That's from me. I hope we can have a very fruitful and enlightening discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yuyun, also for spending your precious birthday time with us and your excellent presentation. So your experience of working in developing countries really helped to generate data that justifies the urgency of addressing mercury exposure in women. Preventive measures that you suggest could help reduce the exposure, and we really should do more on that.
Yep.
So thanks again, Yuyun.
Thanks, sir.
Now we're going to move to the presentation from Donna Mergler. So Donna, you can share your screen now. Perfect, that works. So Donna Mergler is a professor emerita at the University of Quebec in Montreal and a founder of the research center Symbiose, a World Health Organization and Pan-American Health Organization collaborating center on occupational and environmental health. She has studied the effects of mercury from freshwater fish consumption on health and wellness in Brazil, Quebec, Canada, and now in Gracineiros, a First Nation community in Canada. Her presentation also features Judy da Silva, who lives in Gracineiros and leads a long-lasting battle against mercury poisoning in the community. She recently was awarded the Michel Sattler Peace Prize in Germany and Human Rights Watch Award in Toronto, the Art Emanuel Environmental Award, and an honorary doctorate from Wilfrid Laurier University in recognition of her lifelong work to advocate for her community members for environmental protection using peaceful, nonviolent, direct actions. Congratulations. So, Professor Mergler, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Good. Okay. I'm going to talk to you this morning about the Gracineiros Community Health Study and women within the intergeneral impact of mercury exposure. I'd like to first tell you the history of mercury exposure in Gracineiros. The people of Gracineiros live within the Wabagun English River Basin, which up until the 70s provided them with fish, which was central to their culture and traditions, a nutritious food source, and very good livelihood from fisheries and as guides. Between 1962 and 1972, approximately 10,000 kilograms of mercury were discharged into the Wabagun English River system by a chloralkali plant. Fishing activities were ceased, and the community went from 85% employment to 85% unemployment. Although mercury concentration in fish decreased from 1985 to the present day, it is relatively stable and higher than in other Ontario fishing areas. It's nice to be able to link to Yuyun's presentation because Dr. Harada, whom she mentioned often, came with his team 4 times to Gracineiros and to Wabasamong, the other community that was affected by mercury, and identified at least 60 cases of Minamata disease. This is Judy da Silva, and I would like her to express.
I'm Judy da Silva from Gracineiros, and I'm Anishinaabe from Canada. I'm a mother of 5 children, and I've been working towards the protection of the water in Gracineiros for over 20 years, and I've been fighting the effects of mercury poisoning in our river system, and now the water emergency that has been called on last year, and I will keep fighting till I die. The reason why I wanted you to come here was to know that my people are really resilient and they're very strong people. Mercury issue started in 1975 when we discovered the fish were dying, and we didn't know that it was a contamination in the river, because our people are a river people. They historically lived from the water, like the water was our highway, and the hunting and fishing was like all connected to the waterways. So when we found out the mercury was in the water, it had a really devastating effect in our community, economically, socially, and all that. So with the mercury poisoning, it had a really very bad impact in all levels of our community. The way I would say it's like a genocide of our people, because a lot of our people have died from the mercury poisoning, and still today they are. So it has had far-reaching effects in that way. And the mercury is still in the water. And people always ask, well, why do you eat the fish when you know it's poisoned? And what I put to them is, well, why do you still eat turkey at Christmas when it's full of hormones and additives and all that? So for me, it's because it's a cultural, spiritual food, like why we eat the fish, and it's part of who we are as the Indigenous people. I'm Judy.
Women in the scientific literature on mercury from fish consumption. As Yuyun noted, the majority of studies on toxic exposure focus on women of childbearing age, with emphasis on how women's exposure affects the fetus and children's development. Indeed, methyl mercury is actively transported across the placenta, and concentrations in the umbilical cord blood are almost twice as high as in the mother's blood. However, few studies have focused specifically on women's health and well-being. Here we examine women from Grassy Narrows over 3 generations. Yuyun presented data on umbilical cord blood. This is the data of umbilical cord blood from Grassy Narrows. You can see the year of sampling began in 1970, and the sampling went on until, this is hair mercury. These are the hair mercury levels. The sampling went, it was a government monitoring program that went on from 1970 to 1997. And you can see that the levels, although they went down, remain relatively high. Umbilical cord levels likewise follows the same pattern. This was another governmental program, and you can see the levels of umbilical cord that went from very high levels of 60 micrograms per liter, and you can see the one up there, which is over, it's about 175, another one. Those are actually 2 points. They were twins at 160 micrograms per liter. This is where the Canadian put their the recommended levels, and these are the US recommended levels. The community health assessment that we did with the community was community driven and community led. It was a house-to-house survey carried out between December 2016 and March 2017. There were adult and child questionnaires. We used the same questions as the First Nation Regional Health Survey, which allowed us to compare between Grassy Narrows to other First Nation community. And in this questionnaire, we added questions on fishing and fish consumption as indicators of mercury exposure. And we added questions on symptoms of mercury poisoning, and the participation rate in the community was 78%. These are the umbilical cord levels of the women in the study. The umbilical cord of the women, umbilical cord mercury concentration, as you can see, was higher if people said that their father was a fishing guide, and lower if father was not a fishing guide. So you can see the influence there of mercury. Here, we were able to determine the child's hair mercury between 5 and 15 years of age and compare it to the question of how much fish did you eat when you were a child. And you have those who ate fish several times a week, at least several times a week or more, and those who ate fish less than several times a week. Again, you can see the influence of fish consumption on their hair mercury levels. The community health assessment included 98 mothers of 216 children between 0 and 18 years of age. The mothers were born between 1961 and 1998. That is, most of them actually, most of them were themselves exposed in utero. The children here were born between 1999 and 2017. The community health assessment mother's umbilical cord measures are similar to those of the Grassy Narrows women born at the same time. And but their childhood mercury levels were somewhat lower than those born at the same over the same period. What did we learn about the mothers? And we're putting this in a generational thing. The mothers of the 98 mothers, they reported, 34% reported that their father was a fishing guide, and 59% reported that their mother had been in a residential school. Very quickly in Canada, First Nation children were taken from their families and placed in what are called residential schools, which had disastrous effects both on the children and on their families. Mother's childhood, at least half ate fish at least several times a week during childhood. Only a quarter completed high school, and a third did very well in school. The current situation, and when Judy talks about resilience, 50% have furthered their education since high school, whether they finished or not. Half of them are currently working, and half of those are looking for work, though almost half have an income of less than $20,000 per year, and a quarter are food insecure. For these mothers, exposure during childhood, and this is important because this is what happens to them during childhood, is predicting what happened to them during their entire life. Firstly, their father was a fishing guide, as one would expect, because the fishing guides, they ate more fish. It was associated with having done poorly in school, the IQ deficits that Yuyun was talking about. It's also associated with poor health, high psychological distress, and of course, the result of that is that they are poorer than other people in the community, a current income of less than $20,000 per year. Those are Canadian dollars. All these relations are age adjusted. For each child, we asked about fish consumption during pregnancy, and you can see here that approximately 50% ate fish when they were pregnant at least once a month. Higher fish consumption during pregnancy, even today, is associated with an increase in children with emotional and/or behavioral problems, poor health, and more health conditions that impact school performance. It should be noted that these relations take into account the child's age, sex, the mother's difficulties during pregnancy or childbirth, and the mother's drinking during pregnancy. Mothers whose own health have been affected by mercury have to deal with these issues. When we talk about the impact on the children, we must always remember that these children are being raised mostly by mothers, by their parents, but mostly by mothers. Here is an example of what we saw. The percentage of children with emotional and/or behavioral problems in answer to the question, does your child have more emotional and/or behavioral problems compared to children of the same age and sex? You can see that it goes up from 15% to 48% of children in relation to the mother's consumption of fish during pregnancy. Children in many First Nation communities and in Grassy Narrows, many children have been in care of family and social services. Indeed, 31%, 1/3 of the children have been at least once in care of family and social services. And we wanted to examine what the factors were associated with children having been in care. Child's age, maternal drinking during pregnancy and current drinking. Maternal grandmother had been in a residential school. There's a growing literature on that. And maternal grandfather was a fishing guide. This surprised us because we didn't necessarily see the link, and we talked to members of the community, and what they said was it was the collapse of the family. Like the residential school, it affected the family. The fishing guide was no longer had a job and was becoming ill with, amongst other things, neuropsychiatric symptoms. In conclusion, the mercury discharge into Grassy Narrows territory had and continues to have deleterious effects from one generation to the next. In 2020, we published a study showing that mercury exposure in Grassy Narrows was associated with early death, and we used early death as less than 60 years of age, even though in Canada it is less than 75 years of age, because we didn't have enough people among the elders. It deprives the community of elders who have an important role in passing on knowledge from one generation to the next. And all of these effects are due to the direct or effect of mercury on health and well-being, and or the indirect effects through disruption of the family and the socioeconomic situation. Judy talked about the resilience. Indeed, the women of Grassy Narrows continues to stand up for justice and their rights. And let's hear Judy to end this.
We started on this health survey like probably 5 years ago, trying to get funding and so on, and we finally got it done, and now the report is out, and it is a report that verifies that we are poisoned by mercury. I've been to so many meetings where not one word was uttered about mercury poisoning or Minamata disease. So it's almost like I felt crazy thinking, maybe we're not, maybe we're just imagining it. But then I always knew in the back of my head, 10 tons of mercury in the river system is highly toxic. And Walkerton went through E. coli, and they got served justice right away. And it's a shame on Canada, shame on the province, that we are treated so inhumanely. We are treated below humans. And we are just an example of how the Indigenous people are treated all across Canada, Turtle Island. And I feel like it's a sigh of relief that this expert, this world-renowned mercury expert, has found this evidence. That's what I call it, it's evidence. And Grassy being evidence, the living human beings of resilience and struggle and power, I give it back to my people in Grassy, that they're still here and they're still fighting to be alive. That's what I give them, is that they're still trying to live daily lives like every citizen here, that so-called Canada. And that's the really basic human right that everybody has, is to have a good, healthy environment, to be alive. Everybody takes it for granted. And us, we live with that big, heavy 10-ton elephant on our back, 10 tons of mercury. And we still like have children, babies. Who knows what the results are in the next 4 or 5 generations of the children that will be born.
For the past 50 years, the people of Grassy Narrows First Nation have organized many community, national, and international activities in their fight for environmental justice for their people. Their demands include river remediation, a mercury home for care and therapy, improvements in the Mercury Disability Board, and adequate global compensation to the community. And then I invite you to visit their website, which contains a lot of information on Grassy Narrows. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Donna. The history of mercury exposure in Grassy Narrows is the history of a long-lasting battle against mercury contamination. And it is really sad to know that the mercury discharge into Grassy Narrows territory continues to have negative effects on people living there from one generation to the next. And thank you very much for sharing the demands of the people of Grassy Narrows with us as they continue their fight for environmental and health justice. And now we are moving to our next presentation. And it is also from Canada, but from a different mercury-affected area, Nunavik in northern Quebec. And I would like to welcome Professor Mélanie Lemire, who is an associate professor at the Department of Preventive and Social Medicine at Laval University. She also acts as Canada designated expert for the Human Health Assessment Groups of the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program. Professor Lemire, the floor is yours. But just before turning on your screen, I would like to encourage everyone, please do not forget to type your questions, comments in the chat box. And the webinar is recorded, so we decided to ask out speakers to speak one by one and then have a question-answer session. But please do not forget to type your comment statements in the chat box. Thank you very much. And Professor Lemire, please, the floor is yours.
Good morning, bon matin. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I have to acknowledge that I'm a former PhD student of Donna Mergler. So you'll see that the apple haven't fallen very far from the tree. This amazing project that I've been ongoing since several years in Nunavik is the fruit of a fantastic collaboration with several Inuit colleagues that I would have liked them to be here today, but due to the COVID situation, they're very busy. What's important to remember is that these food from the land, these food that Inuit call traditional food or country food, are core to Inuit culture and Inuit health. Country food from the land, the rivers and the sea, they are essential to culture, but as one of a good friend, Inuit friend would say, they also taste very good. These are full of exceptional nutrients, such as iron, good fats, selenium. And food from the land are real foods. They are free of industrial food additive and packaging, for example, from contaminants, as was previously said by Donna, with the example of Turkey. However, some of these fantastic food may accumulate environmental contaminants. For example, the old PCBs that used to accumulate in the fat of marine mammals. Mercury that instead accumulate in the protein part, in the meat of foods at the top of the food chain, such as in the Arctic whales and predatory fish. And lead is another issue found in Nunavik that comes mostly from ammunition. And contrary to other regions of the planet where in the Arctic, there is no active gold mining site involving either mercury or cyanide. Mercury traveled to the north according to atmospheric emission and oceanic currents, and then accumulate at the poles and then further accumulate in the marine food chains. So these are a threat to indigenous health. Indeed, nowadays Inuit exposure to mercury is among the highest in the world. Here it's comparison to Canadian guidelines, but for example, looking at data available in 2004, the percentage of childbearing age women above the Health Canada guideline was 53% in Nunavik, 43% in Nunavut, another Arctic region where Inuit are settled. Whereas in Southern Canada, the percentage was as low as 2%. So there's a major difference between these populations. And here in red on the map is Nunavik. And still, even in Nunavik, there is major difference between coastal regions. So here you have the 3 coastal regions, the Eastern Hudson Bay, the Hudson Strait, and the Ungava Bay. And the percentage of childbearing women above this guideline is way different, because in the Hudson Strait, it's where most of the whales are hunted and consumed. But on the other hand, in these communities of the Hudson Strait, as you can see in the blue bars, it's where we find also all the good things that come from country food, like omega-3s and selenium. So the story is very complex, and how to intervene in these conditions. Indeed, as an example, the beluga meat and beluga nikuk. Beluga nikuk is a traditional way of preserving meat where they dry the meat. However, it concentrates the mercury by 4. And seal liver and lake trout, which is a Pacific fish, can present high level of mercury. But as you can see on the rest of the graph, most of the other country food are low in mercury. And for example, beluga maktak, which is an Inuit delicacy, it's the skin of the whale, is very high in selenium and good fats. Donna and Yuyun already reported health effects of mercury. These are the ones that were documented in Nunavik by Gina Muckel's team and Pierre Hayot's team in Quebec City. At low level of exposure, prenatal exposure to mercury were associated to shortened gestation and several neurological outcomes, such as impairment in intellectual performance, language, visual and sensory information issues, as well as motor dysfunction, as well as a risk of increased attention problem and hyperactivity, as well as more recently with anxiety. Conversely, postnatal exposure have been associated to altered motor functions, both in children, whereas adult exposure was associated to higher cardiovascular outcomes. Neurological outcomes among adults were never studied in Nunavik. This doesn't mean they're not present, it's just they've never been studied. And these effects were reported as low as below 44 micrograms per liter in women's blood. And what's important to remember is that mercury has a very short half-life compared to PCBs, the old chemicals. And that as well, all the stages of pregnancy are vulnerable to mercury exposure. And that, let's say, a very high dose versus a low chronic dose seems to have very similar impact on prenatal development. Based on all this information, our Nunavik partners developed these fantastic tools to prevent or here to act on elevated mercury exposure in research participants, or as well that were tested by physicians. They also developed guiding tools to help professionals on how to better promote country food that are low in mercury while reducing exposure to mercury through some specific food. In 2016, we developed a project with several Inuit partners entitled Ntahatsalit Nihini Tiarnilit Nilituinanut, aiming to promote country food while reducing mercury exposure. We recruited 97 pregnant women across the 3 different regions in Nunavik, and this study was conducted between October and March 2017. What we observe is that according to all the fantastic studies that were led by Eric de Whaley, which passed away 6 years ago today, that PCB exposure have been increasing quite a bit, of 83% since it was first assessed in Nunavik. And this diminution is mostly related to the Stockholm Convention, which was established in 2004. In 2017, we published this open letter in Nunavik because it's important to realize that Nunavik is one of the most studied regions in Canada for exposure to contaminants. Up to 3,000 Inuit participated to research on contaminants in the Arctic, and their information that they provided to this research contributed to these important conventions. Same thing for blood mercury. Mercury has decreased quite a bit since the 1990s by 66%. And in 2017, when we conducted the study, up to 23% of pregnant women presented still blood level above the level required to protect the unborn child. What's important to remember is that our study was conducted between the fall and the winter, and that the Minamata Convention was settled in place just after the study was conducted. So this decline in mercury is not necessarily due to reducing environmental concentration, but rather a decreased country food consumption. But what we realized when we measure mercury in hair is that by analyzing mercury in hair by month, going back in time, we realized that mercury exposure is way lower in the winter, whereas in the summer and fall months, mercury exposure is way higher, and particularly in the Hudson Strait villages, where most of the beluga hunting take place in Nunavik, confirming our hypothesis that mercury plays a key role in mercury exposure as well as many other benefits. Just a quick summary, because this is the core of all the issues on how to best promote country food in Nunavik, is that the famous maktak, the skin, is rich in many good things, but it's very low in mercury. Whereas the fats are now quite low in PCBs, but they're fantastically high in omega-3s. And Inuit, the mizrak made of this fat, is what they call the Inuit ketchup. They dip any food in mizrak, so it plays also a key role in the diet. Whereas the meat of beluga is quite high in mercury, and the beluga niku, which is the dry meat, is even higher in mercury. However, most of the other country foods in Nunavik are low in mercury. And what's important to realize is that during pregnancy in Nunavik, iron deficiency and anemia is very high. And the anemia is mostly related to iron deficiency. However, country food are an excellent source of iron, and this is why it's important to promote these country food. And also that anemia has amazing consequences on the mother and the child development. So it's very important to prevent anemia as well as mercury exposure. And in the Arctic, there's a very high prevalence of food insecurity, a fantastic lie. So then country food plays a key role in food security prevention, in food insecurity prevention. So this is why mercury is not an issue that can be treated alone. And again, we assess the awareness of the different public health messages that were released in 2010 to realize that all the positive message about country food, well, Inuit already know them pretty well. However, only a third of the participants were aware of the message promoting to reduce their consumption of beluga meat during pregnancy. So what can we do now? As Donna said, and as everyone says, mercury is an environmental injustice. There is no local source of mercury in Nunavik. It's a threat to indigenous right to healthy food. As well, Inuit have the right to know and make informed decisions for healthy pregnancies and children, rather than us, let's say foreigners, coming to Nunavik and tell them what to do. They can make their own decision. And there is evidence that targeted dietary counseling promoting food with low mercury can reduce mercury to exposure and reduce the toxic effect on child development. So we've been working together with several colleagues from the federal governments and regional organizations to monitor and ban these older chemicals like mercury, but also more recent ones, but also closely working with regional organizations that plays a key role into this. And in 2019 to 2020, we went around to almost all Nunavik communities to try to find a solution on how to promote country food while avoiding exposure to mercury and lead. We met with physicians, we met with Inuit midwives, we met with doctors, we met with public health, pregnant women, elders, and hunters, and asked all these key questions. Is there other knowledge about country food during pregnancy that should be promoted? How can we make sure that pregnant women have enough to eat? How can we work together to promote country food while avoiding mercury? Who should receive the information? How? How can we support Inuit midwives in their work as they play a key role for providing information to pregnant women and to develop messages that bring together all issues related to country food? For example, Inuit culture, midwives and grandmothers' recommendation during pregnancy, mercury and lead, but also toxoplasmosis, Inuit used to consume raw country food. So this can be a source of exposure to some pathogens. And also iron intake and anemia, as well as food security. Based on this, we developed, let's say, a next step of a project to study mercury in other country foods that were questioned by Inuit. We are also working on developing a clinical assessment of pregnant women for mercury and lead early in pregnancy, and this for each pregnant woman in Nunavik. We hope to develop as well tools for targeted dietary counseling as summer is coming, before the peak of exposure, and to develop different tools for different audiences, like short videos and also certification for nurses as example. And this was released last November. This is a very good example that highlights the importance of country food in Nunavik, and particularly beluga. They say here we prefer beluga maktak than chicken. And as you can see in the bottom of the image is that the quota system on beluga equals hunger, beluga equals food security, and beluga hunt equals community. And at the meeting that was happening just 2 days after this, several Inuits discussing about mercury issues as well as climate change and many other ones. They said, well, we know a lot about these issues. We need to start taking action now. So I'll let you on this. We're working on this. We kind of stopped our activities due to COVID activities, but we will resume all of them very soon. And it's very by working together with hunters and local Inuit colleagues that we can make a difference. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Melanie, for your great presentation. It is an in-depth analysis of the situation regarding mercury exposure in women of childbearing age in Nunavik. And also thank you for sharing ideas on how to promote country foods while avoiding exposure to mercury in the farm. So before we come to our next speaker, I would like to apologize for this ringtone that is coming all the time. I know it's a bit annoying, but we promise to fix it until our next call. So for now we can't. So yeah, our next presenter is Pamela Miller, a marine biologist. Pamela came to Alaska in 1989 to work for Greenpeace as a research biologist, and in 1997 she founded Alaska Community Action on Toxics in response to a repeated request from Alaskans who wanted technical assistance with environmental contaminants. Pamela is also a co-chair of the International Pollutants Elimination Network, IPEN, which is a global network of more than 600 organizations from more than 100 countries. So today, Pam will share with us the results of the IPEN Global Project on mercury in women from 25 countries, from the Arctic to the Cook Islands, including the recommendations on how to reduce mercury exposure. So you're welcome, Pam. The floor is yours. I just have to put up your presentation, right? So you can start, I'll just do it.
Great, thank you so much, Alex and Olga, for organizing this wonderful panel discussion and webinar. Really appreciate all your organizing and all of the speakers on this panel. Thank you for your excellent presentations. Here is my presentation. So just to introduce, Alex mentioned I'm co-chair of the International Pollutants Elimination Network and also served as co-chair with Olga for several years and really appreciated that opportunity. I'm also executive director of Alaska Community Action on Toxics. We're an environmental health and justice research and advocacy organization that works with Indigenous communities to do community-based participatory research, as well as policy actions from the local to the international levels. And I always provide a land acknowledgement. We live and work on the land of the Dena'ina people. I'm here in Anchorage, Alaska. Next slide, please. This is just a little bit of information about the International Pollutants Elimination Network and our mission. We'll go to the next slide, please. And as Alex mentioned, we have many participating organizations throughout the world, over 550 organizations working in over 100 different countries. And this next slide shows the mission of Alaska Community Action on Toxics. Again, we do community-based research as well as advocacy, and the slides seem to be moving without Could we go back to the former slide, please? Yes, so this is our mission. We do community-based participatory research. We have funding from the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences and have done work on St. Lawrence Island, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, doing community-based research for over 20 years. We also work to change policy so that we can protect people's health and the environment. Next slide, please. And I also want to acknowledge Annie Aloha, who was a former community health worker in the native village of Savunga, and she was the one who brought to our attention the very serious effects that military contamination had on St. Lawrence Island, and witnessed a range of adverse health effects, and also worked with us to get changes to hold the military accountable. Next slide, please. This is a map showing contaminated sites around Alaska. So many of these are in close proximity to Alaska Native villages. These are military and industrial sites throughout our state, and of big concern. So we really work, again, to hold the military or industrial polluters accountable to clean these sites up and to protect the health of the surrounding communities. Next slide, please. This is the place where we've done a lot of our community-based research on St. Lawrence Island. We've looked at everything from persistent organic pollutants ranging from PCBs, PFAS, the fluorinated chemicals, flame retardants, and other chemicals such as heavy metals, including mercury. Next slide, please. These are just some photographs of the beautiful place of these Yupik communities on St. Lawrence Island. And these are Inuit communities that are also very reliant on traditional foods. So we do our utmost to protect the health of those traditional foods and to work at policy level from the local to international level, because we know that many of these contaminants that arrive in the Arctic, as Melanie explained, arrive from distant locations on wind and ocean currents. So we have to work at the international level to eliminate chemicals such as persistent organic pollutants and mercury. Next slide, please. Okay, we're leading into the global study that IPEN helped conduct, but this is just a map that was made in 2010 showing hotspots of mercury contamination throughout the world. And you can see, especially in Southeast Asia, India, and China, some very heavy contamination due to emissions from coal-fired power plants. And these are important to us in the Arctic because these emissions actually arrive into the Arctic on wind and ocean currents. Next slide, please. Yuyun touched on some of these things, but these are some of the major sources of mercury that we know of. Artisanal and small-scale gold mining and coal combustion are two of the largest, non-ferrous metals, and so on, including consumer products as well. Next slide, please. This is a concern about mercury transport between Asia and Alaska, again, recognizing the large sources of coal-fired power plants contributing to mercury in the atmosphere and arriving into our oceanic and freshwater environments. Next slide, please. These are some local sources of mercury within the Kuskokwim watershed of Alaska. This is a large watershed in western Alaska that was once a very heavily industrialized mercury mining area. And you can see these former mercury mines here. There's now a large-scale gold mine that is proposed called the Donlin Creek mine in this area. And if this were to be developed, in the process of mining gold, this would liberate a large amount of mercury to a watershed that already has elevated levels of mercury in the fish of the Kuskokwim River. So this is a great concern, and we're working with communities in this watershed to prevent this large-scale gold mining process. Next slide, please. Mentioned that coal combustion is a major source of mercury, and so one of the solutions that we propose is to phase out the use of coal and other fossil fuels that are sources of mercury. Next slide, please. Other speakers have talked about this, so I won't talk about this to any great extent, but just recognizing again the fact that mercury is a potent neurotoxic chemical and certainly has other negative effects on the human body, and that children are particularly susceptible. Next slide, please. So these are some of the reports that are available on the IPEN website concerning the mercury studies that have been done globally. And you can find all of these, as I mentioned, on the IPEN website. I'm going to be talking in particular about this one having to do with mercury in women of childbearing age in 25 countries. Next slide, please. This just concerns the methodology that we use. So this was a hair sampling study. And so it shows how the samples were collected. And this was a collaboration with the Biodiversity Research Institute, who conducted the analysis of the mercury in the women's hair. And we looked at thresholds of 1 part per million, which is an EPA standard, US EPA, but proposing a scientific standard that is lower. We think that the science-based threshold is actually important to achieve because there are negative effects, especially developmental effects, at lower levels than the 1 part per million threshold. Next slide, please. And these were the results of the study. There were 1,044 women of childbearing age from 25 countries who participated in the study. We found that 42% of the women had mercury levels greater than 1 part per million. That's the level that approximately corresponds to the US EPA reference dose. 55% of the women in the study had mercury levels greater than the 0.58 part per million mercury level, which we think is a more recent and science-based threshold based on data indicating harmful effects at lower levels of exposure. So we see here that women of the Pacific Islands have elevated mercury levels, likely due to their fish-rich diet, and the major source are distant air emissions of mercury from coal-fired power plants, cement kilns, and other industries that contaminate the oceanic fish that serve as a primary protein source for Pacific Islanders. And artisanal small-scale gold mining results in the high mercury body burdens in women from Indonesia, and so grateful that Yuyun spoke about her work there, Kenya, as well as Myanmar. Industrial mercury contamination results in contamination of local fish and elevated levels of mercury in Thai women living nearby these local sources of industrial contamination. Women from locations in Albania, Chile, Nepal, Nigeria, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine have mercury levels of concern due to localized pollution of waterways and suspected fish contamination. Next slide, please. So these are some of the key findings of the study that I just summarized. And again, I think the significant thing is that the data indicate that there is a serious and substantial threat to women's and children's health from mercury exposures, sometimes from local sources like ASGM, and sometimes from distant sources such as coal-fired power plants. Next slide, please. And this just shows some detail about the percentage of Pacific Islanders whose hair samples exceeded the mercury level of the 1 part per million reference level, and then the 0.58 part per million level. This is a level that we would like to achieve as more protective women and particularly the health of developing children. Next slide, please. This shows the Alaska results in relation to the other Pacific Island countries where the samples were taken. So, you know, we did find that there were a number of women who exceeded the 0.58 level, and so that is of great concern. I'll talk more about these data in particular. Next slide, please. So looking just at the Alaska data for a moment, we found that 30% of the women who participated in the study exceeded the 1 part per million level, and 70% exceeded the 0.58, which we consider the more protective level. Next slide, please. So these were some of the conclusions, and as Melanie said, because we've done community-based research in these communities for so many years, we do not advise against the use of traditional foods, which is vital to the culture for so many of the reasons that she stated, but rather we present information and have discussions in the community to find ways to reduce exposure. So looking at some of the animals that have lower levels of exposure are preferential to the more highly exposed animals. So we can advise women in that respect, but the decision is really up to them. The informed decisions are really made on a local basis. Next slide, please. Our next speaker will talk more about the Minamata Convention, but this is basically the overall goal of the convention, which is to protect the environment and human health from anthropogenic mercury pollution, and looking at all of these different means to reduce mercury in the global community. Next slide, please. And Yuyun showed this slide, and again, I think it's so important that we work together in solidarity with communities around the world who have had mercury exposures, and to find ways to reduce and prevent those exposures in the future. This is Shinobu Sakamoto from Japan, from Minamata, and we are working in solidarity not only with the Minamata victims, but victims of mercury exposure throughout the world to reduce and eliminate this toxic metal. Next slide, please. This is Erica Pataki from the community of Gamble on St. Lawrence Island. She was one of the participants and also a community health researcher who helped to collect the mercury samples that we collected on St. Lawrence Island. So again, calling upon the governments of the world to take action to eliminate mercury pollution. Next slide, please. And this is Vaiwahi. This is actually at the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, because not only is the Minamata Convention important to reduce mercury, but people of the Arctic are exposed to many different other sources of contamination, including the long-range transport of persistent organic pollutants, including the legacy chemicals such as PCBs that Melanie talked about, pesticides, as well as newer sources of chemicals, including PFAS, flame retardants, and others. Next slide, please. So these are some of the solutions that are really important to prevent and protect people's health throughout the world. And we must phase out coal-fired power plants and other industrial processes that result in mercury emissions, alternatives to mercury and ASGM, stop the mining of mercury and other metals mining. I mentioned that large-scale mining in our part of the world is a very major source of mercury, as well as small-scale gold mining in other countries. Eliminate the mercury trade. Yuyun talked about the importance of identifying and cleaning up contaminated sites and stopping the use of mercury in products. And I think that's all I have. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you this morning and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pam, for the presentation. And data that you shared is really disturbing. And the research revealed that mercury contaminated food contributes significantly to the level of mercury in women while putting their unborn children at risk. And mercury exposure from a variety of sources, be it different routes of exposure through fish or rice consumption, or mercury industrial emissions and mercury vapor inhalation, makes health risk for women and their children very high. So based on all four presentations today, we can surely say that mercury is a global pollutant that impacts women worldwide. It means that no national government acting alone can protect its people and its environments from the harms caused by mercury. So recognizing this, governments agreed in 2009 to start intergovernmental treaty. Just negotiations started in 2009 with the aim to prepare a global legally binding mercury control convention. So the convention came into force on the 16th of August 2017. And as Pam mentioned, the objective of the Minamata Convention is to protect the human health and the environment from anthropogenic releases of mercury and mercury compounds. The scientific community and non-governmental organizations call on governments to effectively address mercury pollution and reduce its impact on people with a focus on the most vulnerable, including women and children. What is the opinion of the Minamata Convention Secretariat on what needs to be achieved at the policy and implementation levels to reduce women's exposure to mercury? And we're happy to welcome Marianne Bailey, who's the Program Officer for Technical Assistance and Capacity Building at the Secretariat of the Minamata Convention on Mercury. Prior to joining the Secretariat earlier this year, Marianne was the Deputy Director for Global Affairs and Policy at the United States Environmental Protection Agency. She was a U.S. negotiator for the Minamata Convention and has been involved in the UNEP Global Mercury Partnership from its inception, including as its chair. So Marianne, you are welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Olga, and the organizers. And it's really an honor to be following such really striking presentations about women and mercury and the impacts. I just want to, on the next slide, I want to show what I want to cover in this presentation. First, I want to talk about how the convention is organized and why that's relevant. I want to talk about some details on some specific articles, but not all of them. And I want to talk about how the convention implementation mechanisms address gender. But first, looking at the objective of the convention, I want to make a couple of points. The convention embodies a lot of policy measures, but those won't mean a lot unless they're implemented. So that's why I was brought on board to the Secretariat to work on helping countries advance their implementation. The convention is focused on health, as is seen from its objective. And as one of the speakers already pointed out, the convention already has 121 parties, which is really great, given that it's less than 3 years after its entry into force. The convention was negotiated globally. Its priorities were set globally. They were grounded in science and data. But that doesn't mean that the prescriptive binding obligations will address every single risk situation in every community. So that's why the convention really has a whole sort of supportive infrastructure that will encourage broad-based implementation that fits all community situations. So in the next slide, I want to start talking about how the convention is organized. This points out the substantive obligations of the convention, and one point I want to make about this is that the convention takes a life cycle approach to mercury. And by that, what I really want to say is that the convention was negotiated in such a way that we didn't want to use bandages. We wanted to get at the root causes of the mercury pollution problems. So as Yuyun pointed out, it's an element. It's not going to go away. You can't put that genie back in the box. So the key ideas in negotiating the convention were to stop it from being mined and to get lots and lots of it out of circulation, out of use. So this slide shows the substantive articles and some of the tools that the Conference of the Parties has developed to date to guide the implementation of those articles. Okay, can you hear me now? It said the host had muted me. In the next slide, we can see that in addition to the substantive article, next slide, please. There's this kind of web of support that's intended to make the convention work well and remain relevant. So many of these articles include provisions on vulnerable populations. For example, the Article 16 on health promotes, among other things, strategies and programs to identify and protect populations at risk. And these may include adopting science-based health guidelines, setting targets for exposure reduction, public education. But the other articles also have similar provisions that really talk about vulnerable populations. So information exchange, public information and awareness, research development and monitoring, and the effectiveness evaluation, which will be conducted soon and is being planned now by the parties. Next slide, please. So then we have the mechanism, oops, back one, please, thanks. Then we have the mechanisms that specifically address implementation of the convention: capacity building, technical assistance, and technology transfer, the implementation and compliance committee, and the financial resources and mechanism. So I'm going to go into detail on a few of the articles and mechanisms, starting with artisanal and small scale gold mining in the next slide, please. So Yuyun has already conveyed a lot of key information on ASGM. So I want to make some broad points about how the convention addresses this topic, and also how it's informed by and informs other mechanisms that address vulnerability in the informal economy. ASGM is the largest user and emitter of mercury into the environment globally. The 2018 UNEP Global Mercury Assessment finds that it accounts for 38% of total anthropogenic mercury emissions to the air. I think we're still on the previous slides, thanks. How the convention deals with ASGM is, no, too back, please. It's really rather historic. It's probably the only MEA that specifically addresses an informal sector. And it does this by taking a flexible approach, which is largely grounded in these national action plans, which call out specifically vulnerable populations and women. The negotiators didn't want to take a very prescriptive approach to this informal sector because it was thought that doing things that are maybe legislatively more simple, like banning mercury use in ASGM, would further drive the mining practices underground and farther from the reach of technical assistance and capacity building, and farther from the reach of efforts that would enable these mining communities to be formalized and get not only the recognition, but the support structures that they need. So national action plans are a central thing. And I want to point out too that countries can't just write their national action plans, they are required to implement them. So we already have several of these posted to our website. Next slide, please. So on the, oops, sorry, got my notes mixed up. So I really like this quote from a global environmental facility case study of mining, which I want to point to later. But the mining system stands out for the feminization of poverty and the undervaluation of female work. So right now, ASGM communities in the informal sector are already vulnerable in many ways. And they're vulnerable because they're dependent on global supply chains. And with the COVID pandemic, they get a double, women in ASGM get a double whammy because they're already vulnerable. They're vulnerable within an already vulnerable sector. And then they have these supply chain interruptions, which are really impacting ASGM communities and probably women in particular. So thankfully, there are a lot of groups that have already recognized this. Many of the NGO partners, non-governmental organization partners that are active in ASGM have pointed this out. And the thought has also been taken up by the International Labor Organization. ILO estimates that about 90% of total employment in low-income countries is in informal sectors. So ASGM would be one of those. It's worth pointing out that informal doesn't necessarily mean illegal. Most often it does not mean illegal, but there's that whole range from informal to illegal. Most of what we're talking about is informal or extra legal. So what the convention again tries to do is bring in concepts of formalization and support to the ASGM communities. ILO in its 2015 recommendation on the transition from the informal to the formal economy pulled out the concept of not only rights of workers, but women and gender impacts. They have done some recent presentations too that also pull this out. So it's pretty striking. We have like at least globally 15 million ASGM miners. If we add their families, that's probably around 100 million people. And the need to provide health protections without criminalizing the legitimate actors in the sector is really critical. Again, formalization and accountability in the global supply chains. In Africa, it's estimated that women make up a significant portion of artisanal miners, probably 40%, it could be more. Countries and projects are still gathering data on this. So the livelihoods of the sector are just so important to maintain. The OECD, which of course has its due diligence guidance for mineral supply chains, has also developed gender-specific recommendations. And it recently did a statement on the COVID-19 call to action for responsible mineral chains. So there are a lot of organizations that care about the impact on women of vulnerabilities from the whole range of things they're facing, but including from the informal economy and Mercury. The Mercury transition fits really well into this. Countries can take their national action plans and fit them into their broader development plans and poverty reduction plans. And that will be key to making them fully implemented as well as sustainable. Next slide, please. Okay. Another of the articles, Article 4, talks about mercury use in products, while Article 5 talks about mercury use in processes. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this, but to note that we have a 2020 deadline for phasing out the manufacturing, import, and export of specific mercury added products that are listed in Annex A of the convention. And Part 2 of Annex A calls for phase down measures for dental amalgam. Now, dental amalgam is interesting to look at from a gender perspective because of the number of particularly dental technicians and hygienists who are women. And another product that I just want to point out is largely, I'm not going to say uniquely, but largely impacting women, and that is the use of skin lightening creams, many of which globally contain high levels of mercury. We are doing further work on the annexes because the convention calls for a review of the annexes no later than 2022. So that work has just recently begun with an ad hoc group of experts that's meeting, going to be meeting frequently over the summer. Next slide, please. This is a schematic of the convention's financial mechanisms, which has two parts. It's the Global Environment Facility, which is, of course, the larger money part of the financial mechanism, and the specific international program, which is dependent on contributions that go directly into a fund for the specific international program. And those are smaller projects that are intended to build capacity within governments to implement the convention. Eligible countries can also apply for assistance from the special program for institutional strengthening on chemicals and waste. That program is taking applications now, and you can learn about it on the special program website. But what I want to point out is that project design and training have to be very carefully planned, of course. And to give some examples of doing that, I want to turn to the next slide, which is on the Global Environment Facility. JEF 7 is the current replenishment period of 4 years that the JEF is operating under. They're about halfway through. And there's $206 million indicatively allocated to Minamata Convention projects. The council just held earlier this month their first virtual council session where they approved several Mercury projects. So they're moving along at a not slowed pace, not slowed in light of the pandemic, and we're very pleased about that. And they have a very explicit gender strategy. They have a gender equality policy that came into effect in 2018, calls for design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation, specific focus and steps related to gender. So 94% of the JEF 7 projects were found to be promoting gender equality and women's empowerment. And one of the projects that has been cited as a model is this Ecuador program for the environmentally sound management of chemical substances in their life cycle. This is part of the Jeff Gold program that was funded in the last Jeff replenishment cycle and is being implemented now under the name of Planet Gold. And the picture there is from a video that you can see on the Planet Gold website called Women with a Will for Gold. It's a very good and enlightening video about the challenges that women in Ecuador have faced to become part of the mining sector in a way that is gender equal to men. So it treats this in a very sensitive and enlightening way. And they've done a very good job in explicitly considering gender throughout the whole development and implementation of this project, as well as other projects. Next slide, please. So the smaller part of our financial mechanism, the SIP, we call it, is run by UNEP out of the Secretariat. And we're very pleased that we've already had 2 rounds of projects approved. And the first 5 in the first round are in their implementation phase generally, and they're moving forward nicely. And in the second round, we have 10 projects approved, and they are beginning to get their agreements in place to begin implementation. I want to give an example of 2 in particular that really are striking in how they will address gender. The Armenia program, which is focused on the management of mercury-containing products and waste, is done not only with women's groups, but actually through women's groups as their key partner. The key partner is the Armenian Women for Health and Healthy Environment. And that project is moving forward really nicely. And a new project which will get underway soon is Indonesia's project to, train and deploy the healthcare sector in rural areas that are faced with ASGM, community health risks. So it will do a lot of training and awareness raising, but really developing practical implementation modules for these health workers to be impactful in the community. So we're very excited about that project getting started, as well as the other ones. And a shout out to Indonesia, that will be the host of our next Conference of the Parties, which is COP4 next year. And one more shout out, there's an open online course on gender and environment that was developed in 2018 that you can find on the web, and that is was supported and is being used by many of these partners in both the financial mechanisms. Next slide, please. So finally, I just want to kind of wrap up by saying that we're looking ahead to enhancing gender equity through digital learning. Of course, in light of COVID-19, a lot of organizations are sort of forced to turn to digital learning, but we like to think of this also as an opportunity for us to enhance our reach in raising awareness about the convention and its obligations, and giving people the tools they need to do the implementation. We have learned, we're on a steep learning curve on the digital learning ourselves, and we're just getting started, but we have learned that digital learning tends to be more gender equitable than face-to-face learning, but it has to be very sensibly designed. It has to address the learning needs of the partners. It has to address the context in which the projects are being carried out. And just because people show up doesn't mean they're really participating in a learning session. So we we will be learning from others of you, including from this session, and we are happy to take any advice that others of you have on how we can do this well, and how we can ensure that that the advice and the assistance we have is tailored to needs and can empower women and others to fully benefit from the objective of the convention and the promise of the Minamata Convention. So with that, I think that's it, and happy to participate in the discussion period. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marianne, for all this very interesting information about the Minamata Convention and the financial mechanism, and also the online course. So that's really great. Thank you a lot. So we are at the end of our presentations, and I thank all of you for listening in. And also thank you so much again to the presenters. That was really, really interesting and inspiring. And we still have time for questions. So please type them into the chat box or just speak out. And yeah, Olga, you wanna take over?
So but just like we have several questions in the chat box. Many of them have already been answered by the speakers, so thank you very much. But we still have one, for example, for Marianne. Marianne, the course you mentioned, is it the same which is provided by UNEP, Gender and Environment?
Yes, it is. I've seen it on many different partner websites, but it is that course.
Okay, great. So are there any questions that you would like to address either to the speakers or to the whole community who are joined the webinar today? So we know that we all receive like huge amount of information, and the data is so impressive from around the world. I know this is a challenge, just to digest all this information and then ask questions. Yes, but as I said, so we still have time. So if there is something urgent that you would like to say or express your position or your vision on mercury exposure to women and how you personally think that it could be, how it could be addressed, this is more than welcome. Also, yes, so there is a question. Are there any indigenous group of women concerned by all questions related to environment and health that we could reach to? And this, yes, so.
Yes, hi.
Yes?
Yes, hi.
Yes.
Hello. Yes, my name is Sarah, and I'm working for Le Réseau des Femmes en Environnement. We're based in Montreal, and we are really concerned by all those questions. And we would like to know if there are any indigenous group of women we could speak to. We could make some links, and maybe we can share information about all this.
Okay, so Pam, you want to answer?
Yes, thank you for the question. There is an Indigenous Women's Caucus that has been very actively participating in the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, and I can provide my contact information in the chat to put you in touch with the women that have been involved with that. So I'll be glad to provide that information.
Great. Any other questions or?
Yes, there is one from Semia in the chat box.
Yes, Semia, please.
Regarding cosmetics and mercury, should we launch a campaign to eliminate mercury in cosmetics? Also, what about nanomercury in cosmetics?
Yes. Does anyone, Yuyun, you want to answer this?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, there are lots of countries already actually monitor the mercury in cosmetics. However, I think it's because it's related to law enforcement and then monitoring vigorously. And also, I think in Annex A of Minamata Convention, it was phased out by 2020, but again, it's depending on countries how they are going to regulate this. I remember also the exemption of mercury used for mascara, if I'm not mistaken. There was also listed that I think if we have enough evidence that all this mercury in cosmetics are severely impacting women especially, we can submit our comments or requests to review the Annex B and make it more specific, because at the moment it's very general, but I think it's possible. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, but still we have data that mercury in cosmetics could significantly impact women's health, like kidney damage, for example, and we do have like data from the Philippines on this.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so there is a question to Donna Mergler. Grassy Narrows, is it near other communities, and is there any studies going on?
2 communities were badly affected by this discharge of mercury into the Wabagun English River system, Wabasamong, which is one of the communities, and Grassy Narrows. Yes, there are many studies going on at different levels. I mentioned all of the demands that Grassy Narrows has. There are studies now going on with environmental scientists in order to do the first studies for remediation of the river system. The mercury has remained on the top of the sediment, which was not expected back in the 70s and 80s when it happened. They expected the mercury to go down, but it is either recycling or there are other sources of mercury from clean cut logging, or from the plant. A worker, after a investigative newspaper article had discussed the situation in Grassy Narrows, a former worker came forward and said that they had buried barrels of mercury on the site of the plant. The chloralkali plant changed its process in 1975, but there is still mercury there today. So there are all the environmental studies that are going on. We are continuing working with the community on health. We are continuing to analyze the data from the community health assessment with respect to previous exposure to mercury. We will also be carrying out a major study doing extensive examinations of people in the community and relating that to their examining the relationship to previous mercury exposure. Again, because of COVID, like others, we were supposed to be in the community this summer, but it has been put off to an unknown later date. To date, happily, there are no cases of COVID in Grassy Narrows because the community has been protecting itself.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so thank you very much, Donna, for this in-depth answer. So we have several more questions, and the one that I would like to read now. I'm certain in our part of the world, many people who live on fish business are not aware of the mercury existence in the sea. How can one provide awareness without getting into clash with the authorities or industrial owners? It's an interesting question. So I think many of us could just respond. Probably we'll start with Pamela. Hello?
Yeah, sorry, could you, sorry, I couldn't quite understand the question. Could you please?
How can one provide awareness to fish business, like awareness about mercury existence in the sea without getting into clash with the authorities or industrial owners? How can we inform fishermen, right? Or should we inform fishermen about mercury in fish in the sea?
Yes, thank you. That's a great question and a very complicated question, I think. I think, you know, raising awareness and conducting the necessary biomonitoring projects is absolutely essential, and involving fishermen in conducting community-based research, I think, is a very important first step, because there's a lot of local and traditional knowledge there that will be important in designing those community-based studies. And I think Melanie can also, and Donna and Yuyun can also offer some important information. But I think just ensuring good, solid scientific studies that involve the communities are I think, the first step, and then using that to inform the fishing community as well as local officials, so that actions can be taken to reduce exposures both at the local level, if there are local sources, and to the international level. But I think those community-based research studies are really the important step in involving those that are most affected in those studies, in the design, implementation, and affecting local and international policies, really critical.
Thank you very much, Pam. So we have Yelena Limberidi from
Olga,
EED.
can I add something?
Okay, Melanie, yes, because then Yelena, it will be your turn after that. Sorry. Yes, Melanie.
I think that for fish industry, it's very important to remember that fish industry often rely on large pelagic species, which are overfished anyway, like tuna, for example, that can be very high in mercury. So it's very important to promote local fish, as well as those species that are lower in the food chain, so that industry also rely on these species, not only on large pelagic fish. And it's important to question also aquaculture conditions, which is most of the fish that we found nowadays in the supermarket. So these are key actors to consult as well.
Thank you, Melanie. So Yelena, please.
Can I just add something more to that?
Donna, I'm sorry. So we have Yelena Limberidi, and after that you can add, because she's been waiting for quite a while. Sorry, Yelena, please.
Yeah, thank you, Olga, Alex. Congratulations for the webinar. Just to come back on an earlier question that someone asked about cosmetics, and just to bring to the attention of the participants that with the Zero Mercury Working Group, which is a coalition of NGOs from, it's over 110 NGOs from over 55 countries. We have a cosmetics campaign going on. So we are looking specifically at the mercury in creams. We have analyzed from around the world, and we have a few reports on the website that I've posted on the chat, so whoever is interested. And of course, this is a very highly mercury gender related issue, since, well, fortunately or unfortunately, it is mainly women who are using these creams. We had a side event at the last COP also, where there was a lady from working especially with communities and with women, So it's just a point of information. If someone needs something more, you can always contact me. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you, Lena. Donna, please. Donna, you wanted to add?
Yeah, I would just, it's to continue on with the previous discussion, and thank you for the information with respect to cosmetics. It's a very important issue. But I'd like to just get back to the dietary issue and emphasize something that Melanie put forward, of the importance of knowing local community, the local community context, in order to maximize nutritional benefits and minimize risks. Just telling people not to eat fish because it has high mercury is not necessarily a healthy alternative. It's important that one understands the source of mercury, how it's going through the environment, and people's culture with respect to mercury, their traditions, as well as the benefits and the risks associated with it. Judy was very eloquent when she said that, yes, people continue to eat fish, but I can add that they are eating smaller fish, and they have had a whole program to identify the lakes in their area that have less mercury and the lakes that have higher mercury, so that they fish more in the lakes with less mercury.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Donna, for these insights. So we do have for other comments in the chat box, but people start disconnecting, so we are here for more than 2 hours. So we will wrap up, but we will assure you that we will prepare the overview of the whole meeting, and we will upload it on our website. And so, and we also will reflect to the comments made in the chat box. So first of all, I would like to thank all the participants of today's webinar, and a special thank you goes to the speakers. We had like amazing, great presentations and many ideas on how to reduce mercury exposure in women and protect the future generation from mercury-related diseases. So based on what we heard today, as I said, we will prepare an overview of the discussion. And this overview will also include the recommendations on how to reduce mercury exposure in women. And when it is available online, you are more than welcome to add your ideas, additional thoughts, or additional recommendations. So in conclusion, we would like to refer to the special edition of Women and Environment's International magazine from Toronto, Canada. This special edition was released in 2017 and presented at the United Nations Environmental Assembly in Nairobi, Kenya. And it highlighted the impact of mercury on the health and well-being of women in different countries suffering from mercury exposure from a variety of sources. And it was the first attempt to raise environmental health issues faced by women living in mercury-contaminated communities or consuming mercury-contaminated food. And the photo that you see on this slide, yes, is the photo from the cover of the magazine, reproducing the poster art about the decades-long efforts of the Gracie Narrows First Nation for mercury justice. And Gracie Narrows is a great example of the role women play to protect their community from exposure to environmental contaminants and to fight for the right to live in a healthy and safe environment. And as Donna said during our conversation, persistence and resilience are the key words of this fight. And that could be actually the goal and the tool and the goal for our campaign to fight injustice regarding mercury exposure on women. So thank you so much again. And We hope to see you very soon at our next webinar. Alex? Hello?
Sorry, I was muted. I was so busy with bringing up the slide. So I also want to thank you again. It was great having you all, and special thanks to our great presenters. So we hope we can move this forward, and yeah, as Olga said, you will receive information from us, and now we wish you all a great day, a great evening. I realize for some of you it's really early or really late, so thanks for being with us. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Yuyun, have a great birthday.
Thank you. Thank you.
Happy birthday, Yuyun Adetona.
Happy birthday.
Adetona. Happy birthday, Yuyun Adetona.
And so we will stay in touch, all of us.
Olga Kadila, Karasho.
Good.
Kadila Olga, Karasho.
Хорошо.
Okay, спасибо большое. Спасибо большое.
You're more than welcome, everyone.
Spasiba. Bye-bye.
Have a great day, Yuyun.
Thank you.
Big hug for you.
Bye. Bye, Anita. Bye, Inena.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
You made it. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Sidika. Thanks for being here.
Bye, Sidika.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Yes.
Thanks, Sidika. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Sidika.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Johanna. Hi.
Johanna,
Bye-bye.
good morning.
It was really great. Congratulations. It was
Thank
really
you
great.
so much. Thank you.
And Yuyun, happy birthday.
Thank you, Johanna.
Nice to see you, everybody here there.
Oh, we should have a party or gathering, you know?
Yeah,
absolutely.
We just did this for you. It's just you. We invited all your guests.
Yeah. I have this. I just want to show you.
Wow.
Party.
Oh,
party.
Really?
Yay.
I wish.
Oh, you wish.
Yeah, that's static.
Yeah. Someday, probably someday.
Yeah, I miss you all. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Ach, die Yuyun. Geburtstag.
Okay, here we are, ladies. Just the three of us. I'm going to stop that.
Okay, so Hallie,
wait.